Imagine this. It's the dead of winter, 1942. The city of Stalingrad isn't a city anymore, it's a carcass. Smoke chokes the sky, the air tastes of metal and ash, and every street corner hides either death or defiance. Soviet soldiers, wrapped in rags, their faces hollowed by hunger, clutch a weapon that sounds like pure thunder when it speaks, the PPSh-41. The Germans will call it the hose, because once it starts spraying, it doesn't stop until the enemy's gone. That staccato roar, like a drumbeat of vengeance, will echo through the ruins of Stalingrad and become the soundtrack of Soviet survival. This is the story of a gun that wasn't supposed to be elegant or precise or pretty. It was meant to be built by the thousands, even in factories with no roofs, under air raids, by men and women who barely slept. It was the gun that turned ordinary Soviet soldiers into an unstoppable storm. Some say Stalingrad was won by courage. Others say it was won by cold and chaos. But ask the men who were there, and they'll tell you it was won by the PPSh. Before we dive deeper into that chaos, make sure you're subscribed. We bring you real stories from the war, the machines, the men, the moments that changed everything. Hit that like button if you love history that breathes, not just lists facts. And share this with a friend who thinks they know World War II. They don't know it like this. Now let's go back to the beginning, before the snow, before the siege. The year is 1940. The Soviet army is recovering from a painful lesson in Finland. The Winter War exposed a brutal truth. The Red Army's weapons weren't ready for the kind of fast, close-quarters combat modern war demanded. Their standard submachine gun, the PPD-40, was good, but it was expensive and slow to produce. The Soviets needed something different, something simple, cheap, deadly, and easy to build in the thousands. That's when Georgy Sh-Pagin enters the story. A gunsmith from a modest background, not a flashy designer like the Germans had, but practical, sharp, and utterly relentless. Sh-Pagin looked at the PPD and stripped away every unnecessary part. He made the receiver out of stamped steel instead of machined parts, cut down the production time by more than half, and designed it so even untrained workers could assemble it. What emerged was the PPSh-41, Pistolet Pulemiot Sh-Pagina 1941. A weapon made for the kind of war the Soviets were about to fight. Brutal, close, and personal. When the Germans invaded in June 1941, the Red Army was caught flat-footed. Millions were encircled, thousands of tanks and planes lost. But among the chaos, the PPSh began to roll off the assembly lines. By the end of that year, over 90,000 had been built. It wasn't pretty, rough edges, crude welds, wood that splintered, but it worked. And when it worked, it spat out bullets at an incredible rate, 900 rounds per minute. The Germans, MP-40, could barely keep up. In a war where every meter of ground cost lives, the PPSh's drum magazine, 71 rounds, was a miracle. Soldiers joked that you could fire it long enough to make tea while waiting for the Germans to reload. Its 62 times 25 mm Tokyev rounds cut through the air at blistering speed, giving it range and penetration no other submachine gun of the time could match. But more than its specs, it gave soldiers something intangible: confidence. Imagine being a 19-year-old conscript, barely trained, handed a weapon that feels like an extension of your will. Light, fast, loud. It made you feel powerful. That mattered in Stalingrad, where men fought room to room, stairwell to stairwell, in shattered buildings filled with ghosts. Soviet soldiers would rush German positions with PPShs blazing, the echoes bouncing off the concrete until it felt like the whole city was firing back. The Germans called them Hell's Drummers. There are stories, real ones, from both sides. German soldiers who spoke of entire squads being wiped out in seconds by the blur of Soviet troops armed with PPShs. Soviet veterans who said the gun never stopped singing, even when frozen solid, even when dropped in mud or snow. It could be disassembled in minutes, cleaned with rags, and be ready to fire again before dawn. One soldier wrote in his diary that the PPSh is a friend, loud, loyal, and hungry. By late 1942, as the battle for Stalingrad reached its fever pitch, the PPSh wasn't just a weapon. It was an identity. Soviet troops began to call themselves papashas, a nickname that came from the gun itself, papasha, meaning daddy. There was pride in that word. It meant you were part of something fierce, something that could push back the Nazi tide. The German Sixth Army, trapped inside the ruins, began to dread that unmistakable sound, the rippling, tearing rhythm of the PPSh. They said it was like the city itself had come alive, spitting fire from every shadow. When the Soviets stormed buildings, the PPSh led the way. The blast of its fire enthrosed. Tight, dark corridors was deafening, blinding, and final. And yet, for all its terror, the PPSh was built not in pristine factories, but in chaos. Women, old men, even teenagers built them under bombing raids, often without electricity. Parts were hammered together by hand. S.H. Pagin's design was so simple, so forgiving, that quality barely mattered. If it looked right, it would probably work. And that was enough. It's hard to imagine now, but by 1943, the PPSh-41 had become the most produced submachine gun of the entire war. Over 6 million made before it was replaced by the PPS-43. And even then, soldiers didn't want to give them up. They trusted the old papasha. It never jammed, it never froze, and it never let them down when everything else did. Think about that. A weapon built in desperation became the symbol of endurance. The PPSh wasn't elegant engineering, it was survival, cast in steel. And it became something more than that. It was the sound of resistance. When the Red Army finally turned the tide in Stalingrad, when they began pushing west, the PPSh went with them all the way to Berlin. It wasn't just a tool of war. It was the heartbeat of an army that refused to die. And if you've made it this far, you're the kind of person who doesn't just watch history, you feel it. So before we move on to what happened after Stalingrad, hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more to uncover about how one man's design helped turn the tide of the Eastern Front. Because trust me, the story of the PPSh-41 is just getting started. When the smoke finally began to clear over Stalingrad, what the Germans left behind wasn't a victory for the Soviets. It was proof that something inside the Red Army had changed. The men who had once fled in panic across open fields were now walking through the ruins like ghosts of iron, carrying PPShs that had survived more than any weapon should. They weren't the same soldiers who'd begun this war. The PPSh had turned them into close-quarter hunters, fearless in the tight corners where tanks and artillery meant nothing. As Soviet divisions pushed westward in early 1943, the PPSh marched with them, strapped across chests, slung from frozen shoulders, dragged through the mud. You could tell a Soviet line by the rhythm of its fire. The PPSh didn't bark like the German MP-40. It roared, sharp, rhythmic, relentless. That sound became the Red Army's signature. Soldiers could identify entire units by it in the dark. What's remarkable is how quickly the weapon evolved from an emergency fix to a symbol of Soviet identity. By 1943, it wasn't just in the hands of the frontline infantry. Tank crews, partisans, even officers carried it. It was compact enough for close work, but powerful enough to cut through a wall. The weapon blurred the line between military hierarchy. Generals posed with them in propaganda photos, smiling through the grime, the wooden stock resting casually under their arm. You'd never see a German general posing with an MP-40 like that. The PPSh had personality, it had pride. There's a story from a Soviet sniper unit stationed near Kursk. They were cut off, ammunition running low, expecting a German push at dawn. One of the men, barely 20, had only his PPSh and 2 drums of ammunition left. When the Germans came, he emptied both magazines in a single rolling burst. The sound carried across the field. and for a moment the Germans hesitated, thinking they were facing an entire platoon. They retreated. That boy survived. His commander later said, "It wasn't the bullets that stopped them, it was the noise." That's the strange power of the PPSh. It wasn't just a weapon of destruction. It was psychological warfare in pure form. In the chaos of close combat, where seconds mattered, that constant thunder broke enemy morale. The Germans respected it and feared it in equal measure, so much so that they began capturing PPShs in large numbers and modifying them to fire 9 rounds, their own ammunition. It was a logistical nightmare to supply so many different calibers, but they did it anyway because the PPSh was too effective to ignore. The German designation for it was MP-41, the R for Russian. Ironically, the German soldiers who once mocked the Soviets as primitive were now depending on Soviet engineering to stay alive. Some units even preferred the PPSh over their standard MP-40 because of its reliability in winter. You could drag it through snow, drop it in slush, even freeze it overnight. It would still fire in the morning. German weapons, designed for precision, often jammed in that kind of cold. The PPSh didn't care. It was made for misery. But not every Soviet soldier loved it. The drum magazine, while offering 71 rounds of fury, was heavy and awkward to reload. The rounds rattled inside it like coins in a tin, sometimes giving away a soldier's position before he fired a single shot. The Soviets learned this the hard way in the streets of Kharkov. Race stealth mattered as much as speed. Eventually, in 1942, they introduced a simpler 35-round box magazine, easier to carry, easier to reload, and much quieter. It wasn't as glamorous, but it made the gun even more efficient. Still, the image of the PPSh with that massive drum magazine remained iconic. It looked intimidating, like a weapon meant for chaos. It made the man behind it look unstoppable, and maybe that illusion was as valuable as the firepower itself. Soldiers often spoke of the PPSh as a companion. One veteran said, "It felt alive. You fed it, cleaned it, cursed it, and it saved your life." By the time of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, the PPSh was everywhere. Soviet infantry followed their T-34s into battle with PPShs at the ready, clearing out German trenches and strongpoints in tight bursts of fire. Many accounts describe those scenes as deafening. Thousands of PPShs firing at once created a noise so constant it became background, a metallic roar that rolled across the fields like thunder. Factories back home were still producing them in impossible conditions. Entire workshops were relocated east of the Urals, far from German bombers. Women became the backbone of the armament industry, assembling guns through nights that never seemed to end. They called it production under fire. In some factories, workers carved initials or small stars into the wooden stocks before shipping them off, tiny marks of pride that sometimes traveled all the way to the front and back again. Soldiers would find those carvings and wonder who'd made their gun. Some said it felt like the weapon was blessed. And it wasn't just the Red Army that felt the PPSh's impact. Partisan groups across occupied Europe, from Belarus to Yugoslavia, used captured or airdropped PPShs as their main weapon. Its simplicity meant anyone could use it. A few hours of instruction and you were combat ready. For resistance fighters, that mattered. They didn't have the luxury of complex logistics or maintenance crews. The PPSh fit their world perfectly, dirty, desperate, and fast. What's fascinating is how much the gun changed the very nature of Soviet infantry tactics. The Red Army began forming assault groups, small, fast-moving squads armed almost entirely with PPShs and grenades. Their job was to clear bunkers, destroy machine gun nests, and take buildings room by room. These tactics would become standard practice as the Soviets advanced toward Germany. Instead of relying on long-range rifles, they embraced the chaos of close combat. The PPSh wasn't just part of that strategy. It defined it. There's a haunting diary entry from a German officer at Stalingrad who wrote, "They come at us like ghosts in the smoke. Their guns never stop. You kill one, and another picks it up before the body hits the ground." That line captures what the PPSh did to the German psyche. It made the Soviet soldier seem endless, mechanical, unstoppable. By 1944, even as newer weapons like the PPSh-43 entered service, the PPSh remained the heart of the Red Army's arsenal. Over 6 million had been produced by then, more than any submachine gun in history. It became a symbol of Soviet might, a weapon built by the people, for the people, that could be wielded by anyone willing to fight. And yet, there was something almost poetic about its endurance. In a war where so much depended on machines, the PPSh reminded the world that simplicity could be power. It wasn't designed by a committee or perfected in labs. It was born out of necessity, shaped by desperation, and carried by millions who refused to surrender. If you're still watching, you're the kind of person who understands that history isn't just about victories, it's about survival. So before we move to the next chapter, the final push into Germany, and the PPSh's strange journey after the war, make sure you're subscribed. Because this story doesn't end in Berlin. The PPSh would live far beyond the war it was made for. Its legacy would echo in jungles, deserts, and revolutions across the world. When the Red Army finally reached the ruins of Berlin, the PPSh was there, pressed into the brick and smoke like it had been forged for that exact moment. The last battles of the European war were almost ritualistic, close, brutal, and personal. You can picture it. Soviet soldiers swarming through shattered apartment blocks, their boots crunching over plaster and broken glass, the roar of the PPSh echoing in stairwells that once held family laughter. By then, it wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was the voice of vengeance, the sound of a nation that had clawed its way back from the edge of annihilation. When the Germans finally surrendered, thousands of PPShs were left lying across the city. Some were still warm. Others were propped against walls as if waiting for their owners to return. Soldiers who had survived the entire war kept their PPSh as a relic, sometimes wrapping it in cloth and burying it near their homes. To them, it wasn't a tool of violence. It was a companion that had shared hunger, terror, and triumph. But peace didn't silence the PPSh. It was too reliable, too beloved, too easy to mass-produce to simply fade into history. As the Cold War began, crates of PPShs started moving again, this time not toward the front lines of Europe, but toward the far corners of the world. The Soviet Union supplied them to allies and revolutionary movements everywhere. Korea, China, Vietnam, Cuba. Wherever Moscow's influence reached, the PPSh followed, like a ghost of the Eastern Front carrying its old defiance into new wars. In Korea, North Korean and Chinese troops carried it across icy hills, just as Soviet soldiers had in Stalingrad. American troops who fought there described the same chilling rhythm, the unmistakable rip of a PPSh burst breaking the silence. Some even said it felt like fighting the same enemy all over again, only in a different uniform. That's the mark of a weapon that transcends its era. It carries a kind of memory. Then came Vietnam. The PPSh appeared again, this time in dense jungles, slung over the shoulders of Viet Cong fighters. It had no business lasting that long, but it thrived in the mud and humidity. Reports from US soldiers mentioned it constantly, how it could pop up anywhere, how its high rate of fire made ambushes terrifyingly short. Imagine that, a weapon designed for frozen ruins in Eastern Europe, surviving decades later in tropical swamps, still feared, still respected. That's not just engineering, that's destiny. Back in the Soviet Union, by the late 1940s, newer designs like the PPSh-43 and the SKS were taking its place, and soon after, the AK-47 would eclipse them all. But even as the AK rose to mythic status, the PPSh never disappeared. In military parades, in training camps, in the hands of young recruits, it remained a reminder of where Soviet firepower had begun. You could argue that without the PPSh, there might never have been an AK. The philosophy was the same: simple, reliable, built for the soldier more than for the engineer. The PPSh was the father of that lineage, the seed from which the modern concept of the assault weapon grew. And while the AK became the face of revolutions, the PPSh retained something more human. It wasn't a weapon of ideology, it was a weapon of survival. Every scratch on its metal told a story of someone who refused to die quietly. Even decades later, when museum curators cleaned them for display, they found traces of soot, fragments of earth, initials carved by unknown hands. It's strange, isn't it, how steel can hold memory? There's a museum in Volgograd, what used to be Stalingrad, where one particular PPSh stands in a glass case. Its barrel is scorched, its stock chipped, its drum magazine rusted solid. Next to it lies a small photo of a young man in uniform, barely 20 years old. No name, just a note that says, "Found with him near Pavlov's house, 1943. That weapon outlived the man who carried it, outlived the war that defined it, and now stands as a symbol of everything the city endured. By the 1960s and 70s, the PPSh had found new life in liberation movements across Africa and the Middle East. You could see it in old photographs from Angola, from Algeria, from Palestine, a relic from another century, still speaking in the language of rebellion. It was almost poetic, a weapon born in the defense of one oppressed people, becoming the tool of many others. And yet, no matter how far it traveled, the PPSh always carried the soul of Stalingrad. That city had been its crucible. Without those desperate months of street fighting, it might never have existed at all. Every burst of fire in every later conflict was, in a way, an echo of that frozen hell on the Volga. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes. The distant clatter of steel, the shouts in the smoke, the rhythm of 71 rounds holding back a tide of darkness. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, the PPSh had become a relic in the eyes of modern soldiers. But in basements, barns, and hidden caches, thousands still remained. Some collectors restored them, some smuggled them, some simply kept them as heirlooms. There's something deeply personal about holding one. It's heavy but balanced, rough but graceful. It feels like history condensed into metal and wood. You can sense the lives it touched, the wars it survived. Today, if you visit reenactments or military museums, you'll see people's faces light up when they see one. They'll tell you it's not just a gun, it's a story. It's the story of men and women who built weapons in freezing factories, of soldiers who fought house to house for every brick of Stalingrad, of a people who refused to be erased. The PPSh represents a paradox, the brutality of war and the resilience of humanity intertwined. So, if you've made it this far, take a moment to think about what this weapon really meant. Not in terms of number or victories, but as a symbol of endurance. And if you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribe now, hit the like button, and share it with someone who loves learning how machines and men shaped each other. Stories like this remind us that history doesn't live in textbooks. It breathes in the tools and the courage of those who carried them. The PPSh's legacy is quieter now, but it lingers. It lingers in the distant pop of gunfire in archival footage, in the rusted remains found beneath old ruins, in the veterans who still remember the way it kicked against their shoulder. It's part of a lineage that stretches beyond steel, into the stubborn will of those who refuse to surrender. And when we look back at Stalingrad, that nightmare of fire and hunger and courage, we can see the PPSh standing there in the smoke, defiant, battered, unstoppable. It wasn't perfection that won that battle, it was persistence. The kind that turns fear into fury and desperation into victory. The Soviets didn't just build a gun, they built a symbol. And that symbol still whispers across time, reminding us that even in the darkest hours of history, when the world seems lost, a handful of determined people and one humble weapon can change everything.